Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to the GMI Rocket Show, episode 18 today, which is crazy. Actually, 4.5 months of doing this has been an incredible ride so far. I'm really excited for my guest today, John Fay, who is the president of LawLogix. LawLogix is a Phoenix, Arizona-based immigration tech and compliance automation company. I was almost going to say startup, but it's not a startup. They've been around for 20 years. So I'm really excited to talk to John about what it's like to, be in a company that's been around for so long in the immigration tech space, what his journey has been to get to where he is today, and sort of what John sees and perhaps what the LawLogix team sees is the future for our industry. I'm Roman Zelchenko, the host of the GMI Rocket Show. I'm a former immigration lawyer myself, and now I'm the CEO and founder of Laborless, which is an immigration tech startup automating H-1B compliance, and also GMI Rocket, which brings you this show and a bunch of other resources for the immigration tech and marketing community. So John, thank you so much for joining, and I'm super excited to chat with you today and learn about you and your journey and sort of what's going on in the immigration space. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Roman. It's my pleasure to be here. Happy Friday. And, you mentioned startup. Sometimes we actually still feel like a startup, even though we've been around for a while. That sentiment actually comes up quite a bit.
That's awesome. And that's great to hear. I think about that for me nowadays. I think about Microsoft a lot from that perspective too. They're a company that's, one of the older kind of tech companies in the country. And just depending on how you feel internally, how you brand yourself, et cetera, startup nowadays feels sometimes less like an indicator of how big you are and more of just your mindset. So that's really cool. I'll be really interested to dig into that. So I always love to get started with these conversations, kind of learning about, the person. We could all look at your LinkedIn profile and read all the articles you've written and have been featured in. But not everyone gets to know how folks got to where they are and sort of how they've built up their career, particularly in the immigration tech space, which is now growing, but still relatively small. So, if we could start there, I know we were chatting earlier today and you had mentioned that your state of birth is Pennsylvania. So I'm in New York City. I used to go to the Poconos a lot during the summer. Obviously, Pennsylvania is huge, but the kind of Russian community does the whole bungalow thing in the Poconos. What was it like for you? I mean, what memories do you have, or sort of what was it like growing up in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, so I came from a very small town called Gradyville, and if you haven't heard of Gradyville, join the club. It is your archetypical one-horse town. I think we had downtown Gradyville was basically a post office, the fire engine, and a gas station. And there was actually, if I recall correctly, there wasn't even a traffic light. Actually, I know that because I got into a car accident right there because there was not a traffic light. But yeah, no, it was a very, very small town. It was only about 45 minutes or so outside of Philadelphia. But it felt very rural, especially growing up in the late 70s, early 80s, and I was very much kind of rooted in family and friends, and for the most part, didn't really even leave my enclave. Like, if you were to ask me about certain places in Philadelphia, even though I would meet somebody, I would say, "Oh yeah, I'm from Philadelphia." I knew very little bit about the city. I was mostly just staying in my own little area, and I mention that primarily because much later in life, I started moving to these bigger cities. I chose a profession that's all about diversity, but starting out, I was actually in this very kind of isolated area.
So, and did you stay in Philadelphia in Pennsylvania? What was the name of the town again?
Gradyville.
Gradyville, right. So did you stay in Gradyville throughout sort of growing up in high school and all that?
Yeah, yes, throughout. I went to a private school, all-boys private school in Haverford, Pennsylvania, which is right along the main line, right outside of Philadelphia. But I was there all throughout that period of time, and then it wasn't until I went for college to Georgetown that I kind of left the Pennsylvania town for a bit. But I also then came back later for law school.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to ask. I mean, so you went to Georgetown. I mean, DC, major city, obviously the capital of the U.S. Big school too. I mean, and the Georgetown area itself is just really beautiful. Did you kind of want to get away from us, kind of get into a bigger city, or was it just the school that attracted you? I'm curious how you went from kind of smaller town, I suppose, to a bigger city for college.
To a degree, it was the city certainly attracted me. I was interested by it. I was more interested so I went to the business school, undergrad business school at Georgetown. And that decision in of itself was kind of interesting because, so growing up, I have an older sister. She's 3 years older than me. And she went to a small liberal arts college called Swarthmore. And, very, very good school. But she had always decided she was going to do liberal arts. She actually, later became a French professor, got her PhD. And growing up, I would hear my dad, and he was always very concerned about, well, how are you going to earn a living with that? And I kept hearing that. And I was just, 3 years younger. And, he was very supportive of her, but I kept hearing that. And so I decided to myself, I'm going to be the practical one. I'm going to go to business school. And so, once I found that like Georgetown had this program, and they have a variety of schools, School of Foreign Service, which is really well known, and others, but I was like, hey, I can go into business school. And this is how I'm going to, immediately have, this job right after I graduate. So, that really actually was more kind of like my decision. It could have been anywhere, but it was really just thinking that I wanted to go into business that drove that decision.
That's interesting. And so thinking, I guess, kind of foreshadowing, obviously, to where you are today, you're really running a business, which is kind of full circle. But you went to law school directly after college, if I read correctly. Did you know you wanted to do that right away when you were in business school, or did you initially think like, I'm going to get out there and work in finance or consulting or something?
Yeah, I know it's probably going to sound so cliched, but yeah, I was. At the time, I was thinking, investment banking. And so when I was at Georgetown, I decided to major in finance. Anybody who knows me now would think that's very odd, because not that I'm illiterate in finance, but it's just not something that I'm passionate about. And what I found by probably my second or third year was that I really didn't like any of those classes. In fact, I gravitated more to English. So I did an English minor. And I really enjoyed the English classes. I actually got into Shakespearean acting for a while. So I took the Shakespearean acting class at Georgetown, which was phenomenal, and I really enjoyed. But the finance part started losing it a little bit. And so it really wasn't much of interest. And just kind of, broadly, I'll say this is, everybody's different. But for me, going to business school straight out of high school, I had no frame of reference. I had no real world experience. And so to a degree, all of those classes were almost just, I never got the full potential out of them that I could. I learned how to work with people, and today, of course, that's valuable and useful. But at the time, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And so it was kind of like, as so many people have said, even on your show, it was more like just, well, I'm just going to punt and, let me see what else is available out there.
Yeah, that's basically how I went to law school as well. I also studied financial economics actually in undergrad, but I double majored with philosophy. So I both did the impractical and the practical.
Perfect.
but yeah, so the decision very often is like, well, I'm not exactly sure where I want to take this. So let me, law school is great. There's no major. You just learn more, right?
Yeah.
So then you went to Penn State Law. You moved back to your home state. Right, went to law school there. Did you have any introduction to immigration law while you were there, or what was your law school experience like, and sort of how did you parlay that into that first job? Yeah,
so my school, which is now known as the Law School of Penn State, at the time it was known just Dickinson, and it's the oldest law school in Pennsylvania, and it's a different world. So Philadelphia area. Is one thing. My campus was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, so it's kind of like near Harrisburg. It's still kind of the middle of the state. And to give you a little bit of election humor, which I guess is appropriate. So Pennsylvania back then, maybe it's less so today, they would always describe it as you have Philadelphia on one end, Pittsburgh on the other, and Alabama in between. And it was, I mean, maybe it's still that way today. I don't know. Maybe less. Maybe we'll see in a few hours. But it was very different. It was it made actually Gradyville seem almost cosmopolitan. It was very, very small town. And which was almost good to a degree, because to be honest with you, I had a little too much fun at Georgetown. It was just, there was so much to do and so much to see, and just the interaction with people. When I went to law school in Carlisle, it was like, okay, I'm here to work, I'm here to study, I'm here to focus. And the law school was, how should I put this? It wasn't my most favorite of experiences. I'll grant you that. It was not something that I would necessarily recommend to other people. I didn't enjoy it. I wouldn't say I enjoyed it until probably my third year, when I got to do an advocacy class, actually. Mm-hmm. And that was the most fun, like, actually arguing a case and interviewing witnesses and doing all that kind of stuff. Like, that was interesting to me, but the rest of it really was, it was a slog, and it was just a continuation of all the studying I had done in college. And so it was starting to weigh down on me a little bit. I was seeing colleagues who had actually taken some time off and then gone back to law school, and kind of thinking that they had the right idea there. So anyway, that's kind of how the law school period went. But during that period of time, no exposure to immigration whatsoever. There was no immigration classes offered at all. So I had nothing relating to immigration. The only thing that I've had throughout my career is technology and computers. And so if I take you a step back to Georgetown again, although I was studying finance and minoring in English, mostly my favorite classes were all computer related. So I took like a management information systems class, learning about databases, applying them. I really enjoyed that in college. And then in law school, I decided I was going to do something a little bit different. I was going to do health law. I was like, well, maybe I can focus on health law. My mom worked for a pharmaceutical company. I had worked there during the summer. And so I decided, maybe I'll just do health law. And during my time at law school, I was able to do an internship with Hershey Medical Center. And I thought, well, this is great. I'll get an opportunity to learn about risk and how they approach things. But what I wound up doing there was actually none of that. It was entirely computer related. So I was looking at all their claims and everything. And I said, well, how do you guys keep track of this in the legal department? And they had no means. And so I had taken all these classes and I knew enough about Microsoft Access. So I actually spent my entire internship designing a database for them to maintain their internal claims that were made against the hospital so that they could then retrieve it. So, no matter what I did, I always seemed to have the computer or the technology thread kind of came back into my life.
That's fascinating. This was your legal internship, mm-hmm. right? This was the internship that you did during law school that ended up essentially you being an IT developer for them.
Pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, but that's really wonderful, right? Because in a sense, you were pioneering without even knowing for your life a legal tech career, right? You were looking at claims within the legal department, and perhaps as an intern, but still you were looking at them, understood what they were. But then the other side of your brain that was like, but wait, how do you manage this? How do you actually keep track of it? How do you maybe avoid errors, things like that? Sort of
right.
click.
It was one of the earliest times when I appreciated, the fact that there was a business problem and interviewing somebody to find out, well, what is the problem? How can I make this better? And so the different people in the staff, I was asking, well, what kind of information are you needing? What kind of reports are you generating? And the person I was reporting to, I was a little nervous because I'm kind of going way off the rails here, but she thought it was great. She was like, oh, this is really helpful and wonderful. And as long as you're getting something out of it, and I was. So yeah, that's kind of how I kind of got started, at least in the technology side. And then after I graduated, it was, to be honest, I didn't know where to go at that point. I had this law degree, I had an undergraduate business degree. I kind of bounced around at what they would refer to, I guess, as like contract review jobs in the Philadelphia area. So I worked at DuPont in Wilmington for a little bit of while. I worked on the ExxonMobil merger, reviewing documents and that kind of stuff. Not terribly rewarding jobs by any stretch of the imagination. And and then I think I got a job with I got a job with an insurance defense law firm in Media, Pennsylvania. But that was the shortest lived job of my career, because I took one look at it. I started doing this research and writing this brief, and I was like, oh my God, I don't want to do this. And so I immediately just, quit that job. That was the one thing. It was kind of like, I never wanted to start a job and then quit it, but that was one where I just knew it was just not right.
And sometimes that's the right thing to do, to get that, to have that sort of self-awareness to say, look, I cannot do this for any stretch of time. Right. That's fascinating. And so I think this is where at least according to my understanding, you found a job in the immigration space. It sounds like you eventually got a job at Fragment. Before we jump into that, I wanted to we got a shout out here. I just wanted to say for the listeners, let us know where you're watching, you're calling in from. We have here cross country conversation. I'm in New York. You're in Phoenix, Arizona, John. So folks who are out there, say what's up, say hi, leave a message in the comments, tell us where you're from. And of course, as we go, please ask questions. Would love to address them throughout the conversation, whether it's about the immigration tech space or anything really that John's talking about. And we do have here a message from Tessa Manuelo. Says, hi there. Hey, Tessa. Tessa is a legal tech and design expert. So I think hopefully she'll find this conversation really interesting. So John, so you're bouncing around all these different sort of legal jobs within different legal industries, contract review, et cetera, insurance defense. That's the one that gets a lot of hate, I think, in the legal space. That's where all the mosquito jokes come in, I think, from a lawyer standpoint. And then you land a job at Fragment, right, which is the large, immigration law firm. How did that happen, I guess, especially because, as you mentioned, you didn't have immigration experience coming in to that job, as far as I understand, right? Like, you're not an immigrant yourself. So what was that sort of nexus for you? How did that happen?
So I know you're probably looking at my profile, and Fragment acquired my firm. So it was actually a different firm that I joined, but I'll tell you the story because it's kind of interesting, or at least bizarre. So I was living in Philadelphia, and my best friend lived in New York City, and he was trying, this would have been 1999. And he was trying to get me to move to New York for just ages. He said, "Oh, you have to move out here. It'll be great. We'll be in the same city." We were, in our mid-20s, and so I started looking, and I didn't really have anything going on, and so I figured, okay, sure, I'll see what I can do. But the thing is, I was licensed in Pennsylvania, of course, since that's where I went to school, and I was also licensed in New Jersey because it made sense, to do them both at the same time. But I didn't have any license in New York. And so I'm thinking to myself, what kind of job am I going to be able to find? I was thinking for a while, maybe I could get a job, in like Jersey City or something, and I could do a reverse commute, but that seemed kind of odd. So, in the end, I just started looking, and relatively quickly, I saw this improbable ad in probably it was on monster.com, I think. And it was from a small immigration law firm in New York City that was looking for an office manager who was familiar with technology and also had a law degree. And I'm like, well, I don't know anything about being an office manager, but I do have a law degree and I like technology. So I said, what the heck? I sent out my resume, and about a week later, I got a request for an interview. So took the train up to New York City. And I met with the principal, and so his name was Ronald Freeman, and so that the firm was Ronald Freeman PC. And Mr. Freeman, I still cannot call him Ron because to me he was always Mr. Freeman. Was an older fellow. He probably would have been 70 at that time. Always wore a tie and jacket to the office. And so I went in there for that interview, and it has to be the single most strangest interview I've ever been involved with, because we sat together at this really long table in his office, And he just asked me all these questions, but out of it, he was thinking out loud, and he kept saying to himself, well, I don't really think you can do this, but tell me why you'd be good at being an office manager. And he kept ruminating, saying, well, I don't know if this is going to work out. And, and it was one of my kind of first real serious law interviews. And so I didn't know what to make of this. It was very peculiar, but I kept trying to sell myself, and I was saying, well, I know a lot about technology, and he seemed to value that. And then finally, in the middle of the interview, he says, look, I need some time to think. Why don't you just go for a walk? So I was like, okay. So I left, and his office was at the corner of Broadway and Worth in Tribeca. And so as it turns out, it's actually right across from 26 Federal Plaza where immigration is. And so I literally just hung out there, for about 30 minutes, went back in, and long story short, he decided to hire me. So that was kind of my entree into working for an immigration firm. I knew nothing about immigration, had really no connection to it whatsoever. It just so happened to be a job in New York that involved technology, and sure enough, I had a law degree.
Wow, that's crazy. That's so funny.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. So the thing that I'll say about him, though, is he was a visionary. He just knew that he wanted to do something technology related. He didn't know necessarily what to do. I mean, he was the type of guy who would come in and say, hey, did you turn the internet off? Or just like one of those comments where you're like, okay, so maybe he doesn't quite understand how this works. But he knew that it could be a competitive advantage. So he had owned his firm since the 1970s, and it was entirely employment-based. Originally, he had done family immigration, but he had learned a long time ago that he didn't feel like he could make money at it. So he focused entirely on employment-based, and he recognized that having technology and being able to differentiate himself primarily against Fragment, because I was one of his main competitors, would be something of value. So my mission from the very beginning was to try to modernize their systems as much as possible. And so when I arrived there, they had a very rudimentary Access database for keeping notes and case assignment and that kind of stuff. We were using Immigrant Pro for forms. We had a separate billing system, all that kind of stuff. And then what he did, which I thought was clever at the time, again, this is 2000, is every single night there was this part of the database would be uploaded to an FTP site. It was connected to a very simple web page, and so clients had their own individual logins, and they could see just the status of their cases. I mean, it wasn't real time, but it was something. And so when I first started that position, I literally was the jack of all trades. I mean, I was the person who was in charge of technology. I was the person in charge of the office manager, which really was just assigning out cases. And at the same time, I was trying to learn about immigration. So, I was doing like an H-1B, as a paralegal, somebody else was reviewing my work. So it was a crazy time.
That's so wonderful to hear, because, we'll get to how you eventually got to LawLogix, and today, thinking about the immigration technology space, there are the players, there are the names out there, there are the brands, but where you started off was very much a beginning point of immigration technology, just in parallel with a few others happening at the same time. And yeah, that's such a great story. It was like homebrew immigration tech that you guys were doing.
Yeah.
So you were there for how many years?
So I was there for six years. And then in late 2006, Mr. Freeman decided he wanted to get out of the business. And so he started looking to sell. And it was around that time that he then sold his practice to Fragment. And so then I became a Fragment attorney.
Got it. And so when you joined Fragment, were you practicing, or did you have this sort of hybrid, sort of tech management role? What was it like when you got in there? So I'll take a slight step back and go to probably around 2002 or so. We decided at my firm, at Freeman's firm, that we were going to build our own immigration case management solution, that it was going to be more than just this database. And so I hired a developer, and we built, basically a SaaS-based immigration solution with immigration forms, with questionnaires, with case tracking, the whole 9 yards. And so I would say for the first, until like from 2002 to 2005, that's essentially mostly all I did. And so I was basically the person who was, writing the user stories,
coming up with the design, giving it to this developer. But then, we fell on hard times for a while. So then I started doing a lot of it myself. So, I was doing SQL queries. I was doing things which now people at my company would look at and say, that was a terrible idea. You should not be doing that on a production environment. But, it was way back then. And so I was doing a lot of that. And so by the time our firm was actually acquired, we had a very robust, very purpose-driven, firm-driven case management solution that was specifically designed for Japanese clientele in particular. So Mr. Freeman had a very large Japanese client practice. And so we spent a lot of time customizing, bilingual questionnaires. We had a fully multilingual HR console, all in Japanese. We had these, what at the time I thought was kind of cool. During our questionnaires, a lot of the Japanese expats had a hard time kind of writing about their job duties and such. And so we had sample answers. So if the person, some sort of manufacturing company in Japan, said that they were in the finance department, then we would say, well, here's a sample answer of what we're looking for in terms of your job duties. If they said they were in marketing, then a different sample would load up. So it was a really, really specific case management solution. But it was just for us, right? We never really thought about selling it. We never thought about licensing it outside of our firm. It was really all just for us. And it was actually part of, at least initially, what Fragment would have purchased.
Wow, that's really, really cool. Did you have a name for it? I'm curious.
Yeah. I don't know how good it is, but it was FIX. So FIXS, which stood for Freeman Immigration Extranet System.
Ah, interesting. Very cool.
Yeah, I know nobody says extranet anymore, but at least at the time, it seemed to make sense.
Right. No. Yeah. Intranet, extranet makes sense. That's so cool. And so when the firm was acquired by Fragment and Mr. Friedman, I suppose, stepped away and retired, et cetera, you joined Fragment. It looks like you were there for a few years. Were you practicing law there? Were you sort of, again, helping out with the technology management side?
So yeah, I would say probably about 2005 or so, even before we were acquired, one of the main attorneys at our firm left, and all of a sudden there was a little bit of vacuum. And I had gotten to the point where I'd spent so much time with technology, but I still wasn't very experienced or skilled in handling some of the business-based cases. So I started doing a lot more of that. So I started taking on clients. I started managing, some larger accounts. And so by the time we were acquired by Fragment and I moved over there, I had a full caseload. And so, I would have been doing, primarily on, perm and a lot of L's. At that point, I'd had more experience. I was doing startup E's. I was doing all kinds of, again, employment-based only. But I really, as I got into Fragment, the technology part started getting kind of less and less and less and less. And of course, Fragment has had their own system, FDBL managed. So it was an entirely separate system. So, we had our system, they had their system. And so that was the way it was for at least the few couple years that I was there.
Wow. Interesting. So you actually went full circle. You started off as an office manager in an immigration firm, ended up being a full-blown quote unquote immigration associate at one of the largest firms, practicing immigration law. Yeah. And okay. Now, this was around, I think you mentioned the mid 2000s, right? Or mid to late 2000s. So you were at Fragment for a few years, and then it looks like you actually left the practice and joined what was then, and I suppose sort of is now, Tracker Corp, which is which was an immigration and is an immigration tech solution, compliance solution as well. Yep. Can you share a little bit about that and sort of, because it sounds like you're kind of transitioning back into more of a technology related role. Were you doing any immigration work or legal work when you transitioned back, or did you kind of say, all right, I've done the legal side, but I really love the tech side, I really love the kind of product management side, I'm going to get back into that? Like, how did that happen?
Yeah, it was, to a degree, it happened for me in a way, because when I was at Fragment towards the very end, they decided to essentially mothball FIX. They decided that it wasn't worth to continue to support a separate system. This is, of course, the challenge of every acquisition, right? The integration period, right? When you're trying to integrate systems and consolidate. And although, I felt it had a lot of value as an application, they decided they weren't going to support it anymore. And so by that point, I was now just doing entirely practice. I was completely out of the technology realm. And I was looking around and I was saying, this is fine, but it's not where my heart is anymore. I enjoyed learning about immigration, but without the technology part, I just wasn't as interested. So I started looking. And so this would have been 2008. I started looking around, and as it so happens, I saw a job opportunity for Tracker, and it really it hit all of it. It was like, oh my God, they're looking for somebody who is an attorney and has kind of like aptitude for technology. And I'm thinking, kind of like, wow, when did they get a load of me? I mean, they're not expecting somebody who's actually designed an immigration case management solution. So, I thought, wow, this is great. And I have to say, it was San Francisco, and I was like, yeah, I think I could live in San Francisco. I wouldn't mind doing that. And my sister was actually living there at the time, and so it made all kinds of sense. I was like, hey, this is great. So in 2008, I decided to go back. I decided to go into completely technology at that point. And to answer your question, initially at least, it was an entirely pure technology job. So it was a combination of product management and also corporate counsel, but mostly product management. And it was a very interesting transition for me because I had 7 years of people always referring to me and looking to me as this is the IT expert. This is the computer guy. This is the one who knows software. And all of a sudden it was reversed. And now everybody's like, oh, well, he knows the law, but he doesn't know software. So, and clearly, and to a degree I didn't, because I had never worked at a software company before. And so I didn't know the mechanics of how a solution is developed, the interactions between, customer support and sales and all that. It was all brand new to me. So it was an interesting transition.
And so when you were doing that kind of work, did you have to you're now sort of plopped into a broader tech ecosystem where you had developers that were either working, I don't know, with you, under you, for you, however you want to say it. Yeah. So it sounds like you kind of had to like relearn the corporate structure or like learn a new corporate structure as far as coming to work, reporting, and how sort of progress day by day goes.
I think, the hardest part about it for me was, when I was developing my own system, it was all like, okay, we want to do this feature. And I only had one client. And so it was very easy. It was my fellow attorneys and paralegals. And so it was very easy to manage, but all of a sudden working for a software company, now you've got all these competing things. You've got sales that wants to do this new flashy thing. You've got customers that need this. There was all these different competing elements. And that I think was initially one of the most challenging aspects of it, but it also introduced me to something entirely new, which was, at the time Tracker had both an on-premise and also a hosted solution. And so that whole dynamic was also really interesting because you had to realize, okay, well, we have almost in essence 2 or 3 different products now, right? And which one are we going to invest in, and which one makes sense, and so that was a whole different dynamic that I wasn't used to at the time, and certainly learned a lot.
I'm curious because you were sort of doing this dual role between technology and legal. Did you find yourself just gravitating? I mean, and I'm nitpicking here a little bit on the details, but I'm just fascinated. Did you do any legal counseling at all at that point from an immigration or like legal tech perspective, or did you just essentially transition to just supporting the tech side?
It was mostly tech, I would say. Mm-hmm. The exception to that though was towards the very end of a period of time when I was there. This was around the time that I started focusing in on I-9 compliance.
Mm.
And that is an area now where I'm more known than anything. But at the time, that was kind of like learning about I-9 compliance, learning about the issues around it. And that kind of took a little bit more of a legal turn. And then actually by the very end of my time there, I actually was splitting my time. I actually worked for Law Group for a period of time. And so I literally was, I was different sides of the house. And so, in that context, I actually was representing clients. And at the same time, then later I was assisting with the software development.
Wow. That's sounds like I'm tired listening to you.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a lot of work. I wanted to just give a shout out to a few. So Tessa came back, so I love the show. Thank you, Tessa. Frederick Stefani says hello to both of you. Hi, Frederick. And we have here Ricardo Ippoliti says, Ricardo here, migration agent watching from Melbourne, Australia. That's very cool. Hey, Ricardo, thank you so much for joining us. And then we have here Rahmad Sabirov saying hello to everyone. And Rahmad, if I remember correctly, I think you're in Canada. So we've got a cool global audience here. So again, we're really fascinating. We're almost at the pinnacle here of your career, big career change. But so folks keep shouting out, keep asking questions, etc. So John, I think this is the point where you're at Tracker for a couple of years, and then you eventually make this move to LawLogix, which is where you are today. And so much has happened, since then, right? This was 2010. What do you remember about kind of moving over to LawLogix, and sort of, how did that go for you?
Yeah, so it was probably early 2010. I met Dan Siciliano, who is the co-founder of LawLogix. He's also a Stanford law professor, and he is just, every once in a while you meet these people that are just, fascinatingly brilliant and smart and motivating. And he and I just really, really connected. And he had a vision for LawLogix in terms of where he wanted it to go. And in particular, around that time, similar to Tracker, LawLogix also has two products. We have the case management solution, and we also have the I-9 solution. And in particular, he saw kind of a vision for how we could further expand on the I-9 side. So there were a lot of things happening in compliance around 2010. We had this huge fine that was given out to a company that built their own system and had done it poorly. I-9 audits were increasing. And in 2009, you had the federal E-Verify federal contractor rule. So all these things were converging, and there seemed to be like kind of this huge demand for additional software and solution. And his idea to me and pitch to me, which really interested me, was to do more with thought leadership. I had started writing blogs when I was with Tracker. They were very basic, kind of rudimentary things, but he saw in me kind of like a person who could eventually expand this out and essentially create a compliance brand for LawLogix. And so that was a fairly significant pivot for me at the time, because of course, I was mostly on the immigration side, mostly on the immigration tech side. That's really all I knew. I knew a little bit about I-9. I did a little bit at Fragment. There was a few people there that I learned I-9 compliance from. And so, I had a foundation, but it was around that time that I really started to kind of almost fall in love with the idea of becoming an expert in something. And, I never really, I knew H's, I knew L's, I knew these types of things, I knew technology, but I found that I-9s, as strange as it may sound, were interesting to me. And so I just decided like this was my opportunity in time to really go kind of full bore in there. And so when I first joined LawLogix, that is mostly what I was doing. And so, I was just kind of just immersing myself in the compliance realm. I started a blog. I've now probably written over 400 or 500 articles, around I-9 compliance and enforcement and E-Verify and all that kind of stuff. And really just kind of expanding out that ecosystem of compliance and building a brand around it.
I don't think that's strange at all, because I think similarly to you, I felt that way and do feel that way about the LCA compliance process. Yeah. And it sounds from your perspective, it's like just thinking back to it, and you you went into college to do business, and then you kind of didn't love it as you thought, and you went to English, and then you sort of started to dabble. You went into the legal space, and there you kind of bounced around. And then even within the immigration space, you were kind of doing tech and legal. And it's like, I feel that so much because it feels like you're narrowing your focus and it feels like you're moving towards something, but it's really hard to find a concrete target. And it sounds like the second you had this idea, this seed planted in your head about I-9, it's like, that's it. That's the target. That's the thing that I want to, that's my thing. That's going to be my thing. Because it does take into account the tech side, what you've done from a tech perspective. Obviously, there's an immigration side to I-9s, but I-9 is broader than just immigration. Everyone has to fill out I-9. So I totally can understand and sort of empathize with that trajectory. And it also makes it just easier, I think, to wake up every day and go to work because you have this specific goal. You're going to get better, you're going to learn more, and you're going to grow within this field of, in this case, I-9. And yeah, I can see how that could be really energizing. So you joined in 2010, right? Mm-hmm. And then, of course, several years later, LawLogix to back up a little bit, was launched in 2000. So it had already actually been around for a decade, right? Before you joined. And do you know anything? I know you joined in 2010. Can you share anything about LawLogix, sort of a little bit from what you know before you had joined, what it was like?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I mean, like I said, it was started by Dan Siciliano, who he previously was an immigration attorney. He had actually worked with a group called the Immigration Outreach Center here in Phoenix, and he at one point or another got connected with another fellow named Brian Taylor, who's from Canada, who was going through the immigration process. And this story is probably going to sound very similar to some of the other people that you've had on the show. But Brian this would have been probably around 2000 or so, was complaining about how his attorney kept asking for the same information, kind of like over and over and over again. He knows he's given his date of birth and his information, but his attorney was just kind of disorganized. And so it was around that time that the two of them, hatched the idea, well, what if we build a solution? What if we actually do this? And they kind of used Brian as the guinea pig, so to speak, because he knew the experience, he knew the pain of going through the immigration process. So from the very beginnings, we were all about building that solution. And what was interesting is from the very beginning, we've always been a multi-tenant SaaS application. So from the very, very start all the way in 2000, that was how the system was built. And the motto of LawLogix, which is largely true today, is kind of like we want to partner with our clients, but they're the experts in immigration law. And so we used to say something like, you know the law, you practice immigration, we'll handle the rest. And so that was kind of the philosophy behind it. And so, we focused on immigration case management solution, throughout that entire period. And then it was probably around 2006 or so, one of our corporate clients actually started pushing us into the I-9 arena after the regulations that were introduced. And so it was around that time in 2006 that we were launching our I-9 solution, Guardian.
And then that's where you showed up, basically.
And then I showed up about 3 years later. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. And that's really great background because, of course, at a few years later in 2015, LawLogix was then acquired by Highland, which is where the company sort of sits in right now. And so even on the website, I think it says a division of Highland. So that doesn't happen often, right? It's something that I've personally researched, I've celebrated. I think it's wonderful. The immigration tech space is, I think, growing quite considerably right now. But when you think about from a business perspective, and I could share this from my own experience, starting a business is wonderful, but you have to have some end goal in mind. There has to be something. It doesn't have to be that. It doesn't have to be a certain amount of money or anything like that. But you have to envision a goal, some sort of an end. And then, of course, when you talk about some of these companies that have been raising venture capital money, et cetera, they require a goal, right? I personally have one, but I don't have any outside investors, and so I don't have to have a goal tomorrow. I wake up and do whatever I want to do. When you have investors backing you, they need to know that you have a goal. I think LawLogix, through this acquisition, did something that, from my perspective, at least as far as research shows, was pretty historic and set some sort of precedent, at least, because since then there've been more and more acquisitions. Did you know what you were getting yourself into when that happened? And sort of, what do you remember about that? Because I'm also curious how it looked when you didn't have perhaps a lot of immigration tech companies to look to as ones being acquired. So how do you deal with it? How do you work through it?
Yeah, so it was a very interesting period of time. I mean, we talked to a lot of different organizations. A lot of private equity groups at the time. Highland was one of the few, actually software companies, standalones, that had expressed interest in this as well. And you do so many of these, they refer to them as the management presentations, where you meet with a potential suitor. You have this whole deck planned out. And we were able to build a very compelling story about our growth. And, and we had been growing. I mean, we were on the Inc. 500 list. I mean, we had really explosive growth for many years. And we were able to tell the story by looking at, for example, on the immigration side, we had a lot of growth in our nonprofit sectors. We were looking forward to additional growth in global immigration. On the I-9 side, we felt like we just scratched the surface, that we had all these additional potential out there. There's so many organizations and companies that were not using a system, and there was so much potential liability that's out there, because we also do data migration and remediation of I-9s. So we really built the story, and the company itself is run very well. I mean, we were very profitable. Which is also good. Of course, they're looking at the profitability of the organization, and we had a very, very clear path to where we thought we could go. And a lot of it, to your point, was education, because they knew nothing about immigration. I mean, it was literally every single presentation. It was, okay, so this is going to sound strange, but in the immigration world, and then you would tell them some bizarre fact. There's multiple different agencies, and they can make up rules on the fly, and we're all looking at FAQs and changing our software based on FAQs, and they're like, what the heck? I mean, so it really is an education process. Mm-hmm. And I think it helped, of course. We had a Stanford law professor that was kind of leading those discussions. So, but I would say the building that vision and about, what the business could be, I think really, was successful. And we had multiple, bids and offers, around that time. And ultimately, Highland was the one that we thought was the most interesting.
So if I can ask, I mean, do you remember sort of what some of the thinking was there? Because, I mean, from what it sounds like, the business was growing. You mentioned you were profitable. Obviously, there's demand. Mm-hmm. Why get acquired? Why get an outsider that you then have to spend time educating when you guys were already growing? Why not just go to work and keep growing?
I think to a degree, both Dan and Brian were ready to move on. They were ready to do other things. Brian completely left that area. After that point, I think that's always going to be a function of the business owners. I think to a degree, in terms of making that decision. But we also were looking at it from the perspective of what more can we do? And in particular, when we saw Highland and we saw, how big they are and how many different industries where we are looking to get into. I mean, the whole HR product line. And it just seemed like, well, gee, this could be really good for the business. We could go further and faster than what we had been doing before.
Yeah, no, that makes sense for sure. Because immigration, depending on who you ask, sits within HR, it can sit within legal, it can sit within compliance. And the reality is it does touch all these things. So I suppose if, when I think a little bit, somewhat 1 or 2 years later, TriNet acquired Teleborder, and TriNet is sort of a mid-sized PEO. They provide HR, payroll, et cetera. Their clients needed immigration help. Teleborder was a little startup that was doing, that was helping automate some of the immigration process. Similar idea, right? Like
Right.
it made sense for both parties to say, we want your resources on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's like, well, we want to have your service and provide it to our existing client base. So and it's just interesting to hear kind of what the philosophy is, and probably largely it's similar nowadays if you think about potential acquisitions, hopefully within the space, and we'll see what continues to happen. I mean, now you look at, I guess, John, you've got the golden touch because just earlier this year, Tracker was acquired by ImmiTech. Obviously, that was Tracker was doing immigration and compliance, acquired by a legal tech company, so a little bit of a different angle, but supposedly also this idea of like taking a larger organization that touches or can touch immigration and then bringing a solution in there.
Yeah.
So everybody knows if you've got John Fay on the team, you're going to get acquired. So since then, I think it'd be really interesting, and probably folks are curious to know. You obviously joined a larger organization that has resources, it has clients, et cetera. What was that transition like, I suppose, or what do you remember about it? And like, what's changed? And I say this knowing that, look, people work with startups and smaller companies because they tend to be more nimble. They can, you don't have to go through a lot of layers of decision making, et cetera, et cetera. On the flip side, things might be a little bit, I don't want to say slower because they could be faster, but maybe you have less resources to deploy right away, et cetera. There's always going to be a give and take. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, what can you make of that balance, and what's been your experience so far?
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail right on the head. I mean, there are definitely trade-offs from the decision-making side. Of course, now there's just, like you said, there's certainly more layers. There's business plans that have to be approved. There's, a lot of discussions. There's, all the, very, very, very formalized budgeting processes, all that kind of stuff, which kind of just tends to go along with being part of a larger organization. And so, that, is something that was, perhaps a little bit new to me. It wasn't necessarily new to some of the people that I was working with that had some of that experience as well. But I would say on the flip side of that, the resources, can be very nice. So especially on the technology side. So we had people who were in charge of our infrastructure, but now all of a sudden, we have a global team, that can be looking out for issues, whether they be potential downtime events or doing upgrades, all that kind of stuff. It's now just a much, much larger bench of individuals that are out there and they're available. And so, that is certainly, some of the advantages that we see. And then what we're, the other kind of element, which, takes a little bit of time is starting to do, the cross-selling, starting to do, going to the existing clients of an organization, introducing yourself, trying to weave your way in there. And, and that takes time. It takes coordination. With a company like Highland has many different solutions, in their toolbox. And so, that takes a bit of period of time, but once it gets going, I think that's when it really kind of gets exciting, because you have essentially like a force multiplier, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. And then of course, it's easier to get in because you're part of the company and you just build that relationship over time. And if the solution makes sense, yes, you're cross-selling, but you're also just saying, here's how we can support you even better going forward, potentially.
Right.
I mean, it's just, to me, it would be the same idea as, if you guys launched a third product within LawLogix, you got to sort of do the same thing. You got to tell your clients, hey, here's what we have. Does this make sense for you? And if so, do you want to chat?
Yeah.
That's really cool and really really fascinating. I wanted to we had one just a quick shout out here from Frederick, said the LawLogix is the best product in the world. Thank you,
wow.
Frederick.
Thank you.
So I'm curious from where you sit, and for folks out there, if you have any other questions, please drop them in the comments. This is such a fascinating and amazing conversation. Any thoughts or questions or ideas for John, please drop them in the comments and we'll put them up here on the screen and ask away. So I guess, John, I'm curious, given where you sit, which is fairly unique, I think, in the immigration space, Where do you see, I guess, LawLogix going? And then by extension, where do you see the immigration tech space going? Because it's growing in one way or another. I'm curious how you view that from your vantage point.
Yeah, well, before I even answer that question, I want to give a shout out to you for all that you've done for the immigration tech industry. I mean, just raising awareness, all the different founders and technologists you've had on this program. I mean, I think so many more people are aware of this movement that weren't before, and I think you've done an amazing job of doing that. So, yeah, absolutely. And that's really one of my themes, actually, of what I think of, because one of the things that I've observed is the immigration consumer. Whether that is an immigration practitioner or it's somebody at a company, they are just so much more technology sophisticated than ever before. I mean, I've been in this market for about 20 some years, and I can tell you, I mean, even as recent as 10 years ago, there was always a little bit of I wouldn't even say distrust, but just uneasiness about technology. Everybody wants to focus mostly on the core things that they know as a practitioner. I want to focus on building out my business, focus on, the knowledge, focus on, running the practice, that kind of stuff. But technology was always kind of on the fringe. I think a lot of practitioners recognize the value of it. But now, I mean, we're seeing, clients and prospects that are they're driving it. I mean, they're saying, well, I'm using this new application because I think it's great. And I think, your application should do that as well. Right. And so there's so much more, tech adoption and usage around immigration. So, kind of one of the things that I see that is always going to grow is interoperability. I mean, we're just finding that there's these niche solutions out there. They exist, like yours, that do something. Maybe they do a small thing, but they do it extremely well. And I think what we're going to see in both LawLogix and others as well is just more adoption of that. Making sure that our software can interoperate with all of these different solutions, so that ultimately the end consumer who really knows what they want now can kind of get the best of all those worlds.
Do you see that as, kind of an API situation where you're able to just straight up connect with other platforms without having any, kind of official partnership or something that maybe existed in the past?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think if you're designing nowadays, you almost have to start with that mentality that you think that you're going to do that. I mean, that is certainly an area that we're moving to as well. And so, I think it's super important. And one of the other areas, if I can parlay over to this a little bit, is I think we're going to see more from the immigration agencies, at least the U.S. immigration agencies, with e-filing. And I say that almost tongue in cheek because they've been promising it for years. I mean, I found a paper that I helped co-write years ago. I think it was around 2003, when we were trying to advocate for, the use of technology and immigration, actually like listening to us. And now we're starting to see, although there's been billions of dollars spent on Ellis and these other programs, it seems like they're finally now getting their act together, I think. And so it's going to become more imperative for all of the immigration providers, especially in the US space, but certainly in others as well, to be able to support these types of e-filing things as well. And so, I hope that's through APIs eventually. It drives me mad that USCIS and Department of Labor and Department of State don't do any of that right now, right? And so instead, you have all of us case management vendors doing screen scraping and plopping in pieces of data on a page-by-page basis, and it's so terribly inefficient. But I'm hopeful that eventually we can get there.
Yeah, agreed. And I'm from my perspective, looking at the DOL side, I've talked to some of the folks at AILA conferences and other events from DOL, and I said, look, this is when they were launching Flag, and I said, look, you're building this right now. You're building it now from scratch. I mean. And they said, no, we're not letting any third parties plug in. We're not going to have any APIs available. And to your point, what happens is that you have these scenarios where you have to start scraping, but then you have to make sure that you're not violating any, any rules and any laws. You're not filing, quote unquote, anything that's, not a genuine application. And that makes it challenging because we're both trying to keep up with market demand. And I mean, look, if you have to say we can't do this because it's impossible, then the clients can't say anything, but you want to provide the service to the client, and you turn around and the government just, not to, to say this, as you said, tongue in cheek, they're putting up walls around the immigration process from a technological perspective, which is kind of challenging. But yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with you, and I hope that it gets there. Unless there's going to be a Facebook of immigration that gobbles up everybody, and you have everything under one roof. I think that would be interesting. I don't see that happening, and I think, to your point, interoperability is probably the way to go. If I can ask you just one or two more questions here, what's something that you're kind of most excited about from the immigration technology standpoint?
I would say the most exciting thing that I see is machine learning and analytics. This is just an area that I just think is so fascinating because of all of the data that we consume as immigration practitioners out there, and because of all of the uncertainty that we often feel when we're filing applications. And that uncertainty is something that is felt by our clients, clients. And there's such a wealth of opportunity, I think, that is still even now untapped to designing a solution that can really pour through all of the filings that you've done, that can really get to the point where it's doing more in the predictive side. So, we know that this person has such and such an occupation, and we're going to analyze, their educational background. We're going to analyze their work history. We're going to look at the service center where it's going to be filed. We're going to look at all the information that we have on that service center in terms of RFE rates and all of this stuff. And I feel like all that data is being processed. It exists, but putting it in a way and fashioning in such a way so that practitioners can ultimately use it in an intelligent fashion. And I'm not saying that we're ever, replacing immigration lawyers or replacing some of the, the black magic, so to speak, that happens based on your own experience and intuition, but just supporting and facilitating that, I think is really interesting to me. And I'll be really curious to see where we go and also even where others go as well.
Yeah, it's really just supporting the decision-making process. Maybe you get your first level analysis from an AI and then you double check it, but the AI is doing the heavy lifting of researching and pulling data and things like that. Super fascinating. Even more broadly, AI in the law is a big discussion, right? To your point about you have ethics coming into play, and well, how much can you ever just rely on AI completely and then have maybe a human adjudicator for an appeal, but maybe a first level decision comes from a bot? I don't know. We'll see. We've got one kind of interesting question here from Tessa, which kind of fits in a little bit maybe to your trajectory as an attorney, is whether you felt like you don't fit in traditional law. And I think the way that I read this question is, do you feel like you don't fit in as a traditional lawyer, and how do you deal with it? I definitely felt this way. I mean, I practiced immigration law for just under a year and a half, and I truly loved business development, and sort of I always had questions about, well, why does this work the way it does from an internal process perspective, or always had questions about technology. And I think maybe like you did, I kind of took a look inside and I'm like, man, I don't really love the thing that I thought I was gonna love. How do you feel about, like, how did you deal with it? I know at first you switched jobs, but maybe how would you recommend others deal with it if they're practicing law, whether immigration or something else, and they're just like, oh, I don't love this?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question, Tessa. For me, it was something that I kind of embraced after a while, in a way, because for sure, I definitely felt that way many times. In fact, even going back to law school, I felt I didn't belong there either. So it wasn't perhaps a stretch to say that I would feel the same thing. But what I recognized is what a wonderful, valuable degree the law degree is. I mean, it opened doors for me. It really changed the way I think about things. It's so much formed even the way I analyze and write, so much about it, so that I feel like I can take the best parts of that law degree, being a lawyer, the analytical side, and I can do a lot of different things with it. And when I speak to people, even in my current role, which is clearly not a lawyer, clearly on the software side, I find that I use it all the time. And when people hear that I'm a lawyer, they're fully accepting of it. I don't think, this is just my opinion, but I think the nature of traditional lawyer doesn't even exist anymore, or at least it's starting to slowly move away, because there's so much you can do with it. And to me, again, I just look at it as, this is great. You know, I don't have to be a traditional lawyer. I can do something else with this degree, and it'll still, add value.
Couldn't agree more. And then if you're on the legal tech side, whether you're doing sales, business development, or marketing, especially if you're doing sales, the fact that you might be a lawyer, have a law degree, just immediately legitimizes your pitch, your product, your service, whatever it is that you're selling. And I think that helps, right? Cool. I wanted to kind of end this discussion with one fun question. You mentioned, aside from your excitement for I-9 and for immigration technology, I think the second thing you're most excited about is Shakespeare, it sounds like. I'm curious, when you took that class in Georgetown, what was your kind of, what play did you perform in, and do you remember anything from it?
I do. It was Othello, and I played Othello.
Wow.
It was intense. I had to do one particular scene, and I remember being with Desdemona, and it was the thing about it I remember the most. It was a scene very much filled with passion, and we were supposed to kiss, but Desdemona, she wasn't really into it. We had more of a platonic type of kiss, but other than that, my acting, I thought, was pretty good. And but what it did, it just, for me, it was a great experience. I got to know people in ways that I never thought possible. If I had to do my life all over again, I would have actually done something with acting, which is funny for me to say, because I'm actually a very generally quiet person, but there's something about it that is just so fascinating to me, and just to become something else or somebody else. But anyway, it was enjoyable.
Can I ask, do you think that your experience and maybe your realization of your appreciation for and love for acting has shaped you professionally in any way?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. For sure. There's definitely a ham in me somewhere. And when you're tasked with, telling a group full of HR audience members why they should listen to you for 60 minutes to talk about a 2-page form, you find yourself having to be creative, right? And having to try to spin a story and make it interesting. And so what I've done, and what gives me pleasure, is to be able to use those skills, and so, like, for example, I know, Roman, you and I talked about this a while ago. I use this application called Prezi, which is a Zooming presentation, and I had so much fun with it, because I try to go kind of like a day in the life of an HR person, and I explore all the different pains that they have with hiring somebody, and I zoom out and I give them perspective, and I do all these different things, and ultimately, my goal is to educate in kind of a fun way. And the way that I do that is by being a little bit of a goofball, and trying to bring forth some of those latent acting skills.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you anymore, because my love and experience with improv, I think I try to bring that into my professional life every day, whether through, even doing this, even being on camera or behind a mic and talking to, sharing a story about your business and your product. I think we're always storytelling. And if you have that knack or have that interest, personally, I think it helps. Do you remember any lines from Othello?
Oh my God. Oh, curse of marriage, something. It's been too long, Roman. I could probably take the M274 I-9 handbook for you, but
fair enough. That's the Othello now is the I-9 handbook for you. I tried.
Yeah.
Well, John, thank you so much. This was a fascinating, really interesting conversation. Really appreciate you sharing your story. And wow, I mean, so much insight into how a career in immigration technology can really blossom and grow, partly accidentally and partly because of realizations with, through meeting people and such. So thank you for spending your time and for sharing that with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. What an episode. I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope you all learned something. If you have any questions, by the way, for John regarding LawLogix, check out lawlogix.com. Check out the website and learn about the product. Reach out to their team if you have any questions. If you have any questions for me, you can find me on LinkedIn or Facebook or any of those platforms. Thank you all so much. Go read some Shakespeare and get into acting, get into theater. I will always plug that. My second love after immigration technology is also theater. I think it's wonderful. So thank you so much for listening. Thanks for sharing your time. Peace.